spent years building the division, fixing crises, carrying clients, and being told, "You're next." Then, in a packed conference room, the promotion was announced, not mine, but his daughter's. Fresh title, loud applause, my name mentioned only as support, smiles everywhere. I clapped too because that's what they expected. That moment made one thing clear. My work was never the goal. I was the bridge they planned to burn after crossing. If you've ever been pushed aside for someone connected, stay with me. Subscribe and tell me in the comments if this has happened to you. The conference room doors closed behind us with that soft hydraulic click that always meant something official was about to happen. And before anyone even sat down, Richard cleared his throat and said, "Let's get started," projecting his voice like this was a celebration. I took my usual seat near the end of the table, notebook closed, coffee untouched. Then the slide appeared on the screen. New Regional Strategy and Growth Director, Claire Hale. Applause started immediately, sharp and automatic, the kind people give before their brains catch up. I didn't move at first. Claire stood up, smoothing her blazer, smiling like she'd practiced it in the mirror. Richard beamed. "Claire has shown incredible promise in a very short time," he said, eyes scanning the room without landing on me. "Fresh perspective, energy, exactly what this division needs going forward." Someone glanced at me. I clapped, slowly. My name came next, not on the slide, not in the title, but in a sentence. And of course, Mila has been invaluable supporting Claire and helping her get up to speed. Supporting, not leading, not building. Supporting, that was the moment. That was the line. I felt heat climb my neck while everyone nodded like this made sense. Claire thanked the team, said she was excited to learn from all of us, and when she looked at me, it was with relief, not respect. The meeting moved on. Budgets, timelines, action items. No one asked a question about how a 4-month employee was now overseeing a region she didn't understand. When it ended, people stood, shook Claire's hand, congratulated her. One whispered, "Well deserved," loud enough for me to hear. I gathered my folder and stood last. Richard caught up to me by the door. "Mila, can we talk for a second?" We stepped back inside. He loosened his tie, dropped the smile. "I know this might feel sudden." I said nothing. "But Claire brings something different. Strategic polish. The board likes that." I looked at him and said, "So the role I was told I was being prepared for no longer exists?" He smiled again, thinner this time. "It exists. It's just evolving." Then he added quietly, "You understand, right? This isn't personal." That was mock-mott. The betrayal wasn't subtle. It was formal, public, and sealed with applause. I nodded because that's what keeps meetings moving. I walked back to my desk, logged in, and within minutes an email hit my inbox from HR, time-stamped earlier that morning. Subject, updated reporting structure. My name was listed under Claire's, effective immediately. No discussion, no warning. I stared at the screen until the words stopped shifting. Then I closed the laptop. At 4:17 p.m., I printed one page. At 4:30, I knocked on Richard's office door. He looked up, surprised. I placed the envelope on his desk. "This is my notice." He laughed once, short and confused. "You're emotional. Sit down." I didn't. "You're walking away over a title?" he said. "Over being patient a little longer?" I said, "You decided my ceiling without me. I'm just accepting it." His face hardened. "Think carefully. You have responsibilities. Stability matters at your stage." There it was, the leverage he thought he had. I said, "I'll finish the transition period." He leaned back, relief flashing before he caught it. "Good. Claire will need guidance." That was mock high. The power started shifting right there, not because I raised my voice, not because I argued, but because the room had finally made something clear. They didn't know how much of this place ran through me, and they just assumed I'd keep holding it together for them. By the time I reached my desk, the floor had settled back into its normal rhythm. Phones ringing, keyboards tapping, people already moving on as if nothing permanent had happened. I sat down, logged back in, and opened the shared drive Claire now technically owned. Files I had built over years sat there under her name. No anger came, just a quiet sorting of facts. At 5:02 p.m., Richard sent a calendar invite titled Transition Sync, mandatory, tomorrow morning, no note, no explanation. I accepted it without hesitation. The decision was already made. That night, there was no dramatic exit, no box under my arm. I finished the day exactly the way they expected me to. I closed open loops, returned 2 vendor calls, approved a shipment reroute that would have caused a client shutdown if delayed. At 6:40, Claire stopped by my desk, standing a little too straight. "I hope this isn't awkward," she said. "I'm really counting on you." I looked up and said, "You'll have what you need." That was true. What I didn't say was for how long. The next morning, the transition meeting lasted 12 minutes. Richard outlined expectations, used words like collaboration and continuity, never once acknowledging what had actually changed. Claire took notes fast, nodded often. When it ended, Richard said, "Mila, make sure Claire has full visibility into everything by the end of the week." "Not by the end of my notice. By the end of the week." I said, "Understood." After they left, I opened a new document and started listing dependencies. Accounts that escalated directly to me. Vendors who bypassed procurement because timelines mattered. Processes that only worked because someone made judgment calls instead of following flowcharts. It wasn't proprietary. It was practical, and most of it lived in people, not systems. By noon, the first crack appeared. A supplier emailed Claire asking for confirmation on a reroute tied to a delayed shipment. She forwarded it to me with one line. "Can you take this?" I replied with instructions instead of taking over. 10 minutes later, she was back at my desk, whispering, "They're pushing back." I stood, walked her through the call, and watched as she repeated my words, slightly off, missing the pressure points. It worked anyway, because the supplier recognized my name in the background. That was the pattern for the rest of the day. Requests came to her, stalled, then slid sideways to me. I didn't block them. I didn't fix them silently either. I stayed visible. At 3:15, Richard called me into his office. "I want to be clear," he said. "We need stability during this transition." I said, "You'll get exactly what's been agreed to." He studied me, searching for something. Anger, bluff, weakness. He didn't find it. When I walked out, my badge still worked, my access unchanged, but the balance had shifted. They thought they'd secured cooperation. What they'd actually done was put a clock on everything that had been quietly holding their structure together. The following day, the tone changed. Richard didn't bother with pretense anymore. He called me into his office with Claire already seated, laptop open, screen angled away from me like a shield. "We need alignment," he said, folding his hands. "This transition has to be clean." I nodded and waited. He slid a printed document across the desk, a revised role description. My name at the top, a new title underneath it, reporting to Claire. Same responsibilities I'd always carried, minus authority. "This keeps you involved," he said. "Shows good faith." I read the page, set it back down, and said, "I'm not accepting a new role." Claire shifted in her chair. Richard's jaw tightened. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." He leaned forward. "People notice how exits happen. References matter." I met his eyes. "So does accuracy." He smiled without warmth. "Let's not pretend you're irreplaceable." After that, the pressure arrived in pieces. Legal sent a reminder about confidentiality. HR emailed asking for a detailed knowledge transfer schedule, broken down by hour. Operations flagged my approvals for secondary review. None of it stopped my work, but all of it signaled the same thing. Comply quietly or be framed as the problem. Claire tried a different approach. She caught me near the copier and said, "I don't want this to be adversarial." I said, then don't make it that." She asked me to walk her through an account escalation that had bypassed her inbox entirely. I explained the criteria, the thresholds, the judgment calls. She wrote everything down and still looked uncertain. Later, Richard summoned me again. "We're concerned," he said. "Clients are confused about who's in charge." I replied, "Then clarify it." He said, "You could help by stepping back." I said, "I already have." That afternoon, a message went out to senior partners announcing Claire as the sole point of contact for regional decisions. My name was absent. Within minutes, my phone lit up. Vendors asking if the note was accurate. A client asking who would handle an issue already in motion. I responded once, carefully, copying Claire on each reply. "Please coordinate with Claire. She has authority." The questions didn't stop. They just slowed, then reappeared in different forms. Richard tried one last angle before the week ended. He closed the door and said, "If you leave on these terms, we won't be able to support your next move." I said, "I'm not asking you to." He raised his voice for the first time. "You're burning bridges." I said, "You lit this one." He stared, then sat back, recalibrating. "Fine," he said. "Finish your documentation. Train Claire. We'll part professionally." The word professionally hung there, heavy with conditions. I went back to my desk and continued exactly as instructed. I documented processes, not instincts. I mapped workflows, not relationships. I answered questions, but I didn't intercept consequences. When approvals stalled because Claire hesitated, I didn't override. When emails stacked because she was included on threads she didn't understand, I didn't translate unless asked. By the end of the day, it was clear they'd mistaken compliance for surrender. They thought a signature and a threat could keep the machinery running the same way. What they didn't see was that authority without understanding creates drag, and drag turns into delay, and delay is the one thing operations never forgives. By Monday morning, the change was no longer theoretical. It showed up in calendars, in unanswered emails, in decisions that stalled just long enough to be noticed. Claire had the title now, which meant everything flowed to her first. She sat in meetings taking notes while questions piled up waiting for answers she didn't have yet. At 9:12 a.m., a vendor escalation hit her inbox about a delayed component shipment that fed 3 downstream orders. She forwarded it to me with a question mark. I replied with options, not instructions, and copied Richard. 10 minutes passed, then 20. The vendor followed up, tone sharpening. Claire called me from her desk, whispering, "Which one would you choose?" I said, "You're the decision maker." She swallowed and made the call. It was the wrong one. By noon, a client was on hold threatening penalties. Richard convened an emergency huddle. Claire explained what she'd done. No one contradicted her. I said nothing. Afterward, Richard pulled me aside. "You could have stepped in," he said. I replied, "You asked for clarity on authority." He didn't like that answer. The afternoon brought more of the same. A logistics partner requested an exception that normally took me 30 seconds to approve. Claire asked legal first. Legal asked finance. Finance asked for a risk memo. By the time approval came through, the window had closed and the shipment rolled to the next cycle. The client emailed all caps. Claire forwarded it to me again. I drafted a response, sent it to her for approval, and waited. When it went out, the apology landed late and flat. The client replied with a single sentence. "This can't happen again." Word moved fast. Vendors started double-checking everything. Clients asked for confirmations they'd never needed before. The systems didn't break. They slowed, and that was worse. At 3:40, Richard called another meeting. He used the word growing pains. He asked for patience. Claire nodded, eyes fixed on her screen. Someone asked about contingency authority. Richard said, "We're aligned." No one asked aligned how. The next morning, the biggest account on the board flagged a discrepancy in their delivery schedule. Claire tried to reconcile 2 dashboards that didn't speak the same language. She missed the pattern. I saw it immediately. I waited. When the client called, they asked for me by name. I said, "Claire is leading now." There was a pause on the line. "Put her on," the client said. I listened as Claire walked through the data, circling the issue without touching it. The client interrupted. "Who built this workflow?" Claire glanced at me. "Mila did," she said. "Then why isn't Mila making this call?" Silence. After the call, Richard closed his office door. "This can't continue," he said. "Perception matters." I said, "Then match authority to capability." He stared, then said, "Help us stabilize." I said, "I am." That afternoon, HR sent a reminder about my end date. A friendly note. Claire asked if I could stay late to walk through a vendor matrix. I agreed and did exactly that, explaining inputs, outputs, thresholds. She asked if I'd be available after I left. I said, "During business hours, through my last day." She nodded, looking smaller than she had a week ago. By the end of the day, the cracks were visible to everyone, not just me. Decisions lagged, accountability blurred. The organization wasn't failing loudly, it was bleeding time. And time, once lost, doesn't come back just because someone with a title asks it to. The week compressed into a single long day where everything urgent arrived at once and nothing moved fast enough. By mid-morning, Claire's calendar was wall-to-wall, and every meeting ended with an action item that landed back in her inbox without a decision attached. A carrier requested a deviation on a weather reroute, time-sensitive and routine. Claire asked finance for cost exposure. Finance asked operations for impact. Operations asked for confirmation from the carrier already waiting. The request expired. An hour later, a different vendor flagged a mismatch between forecast and allocation. Claire scheduled a review instead of approving a temporary release. The line stalled. When the alert reached me, I forwarded the criteria I used to decide those calls, then stopped. I didn't intercept, didn't reframe, didn't rescue. The system behaved exactly as it was told to. Richard tried to speed things up with emails labeled urgent, copying more people, widening the blast radius. That made it worse. Threads multiplied, answers conflicted. Claire started keeping a running list of questions on a yellow pad, crossing off none of them. At noon, a client escalated directly to Richard after a missed window triggered penalties. He pulled me into the room and said, "We need this solved now." I said, "Who's accountable?" He looked at Claire. She looked at the dashboard. The room waited. Finally, Richard said, "Mila, what would you do?" I said, "I decide." He exhaled sharply. "Do it." I didn't move. "You named the authority," I said. "Use it." The silence stretched until Claire made a call that minimized cost and maximized risk. The penalty landed anyway. Richard blamed the vendor in his follow-up note. The vendor replied with timestamps. After lunch, legal circulated guidance tightening approvals. That added another step. A partner asked for a workaround we'd used for years. Claire searched the drive, found a document, and missed the footnote that made it safe. She paused. I waited. She chose caution. The partner escalated. Richard called me again. "Why didn't you flag this?" I said, "It wasn't my decision." His voice rose. "You're being difficult." I said, "I'm being accurate." By late afternoon, the pressure shifted from operational to reputational. A senior client asked for reassurance that the team was stable. Claire drafted a response heavy on vision and light on specifics. Richard edited it to sound confident. They sent it. The client replied, asking for a call with me. I declined and copied Claire. The call went ahead without me and ended early. At 4:50, HR sent a note confirming my final day and reminding me to return equipment. Claire stopped by my desk with a stack of printouts. "Can you sanity check these?" she asked. I said, "I can explain the assumptions." She nodded. I explained. She nodded again and changed nothing. When the numbers came back misaligned an hour later, she asked why. I said, "Because assumptions drive outcomes." She stared at the screen, then asked if I could stay. I stayed until the clock hit the hour I'd committed to. As I packed my bag, a notification popped up announcing a new task force to address temporary slowdowns. It named Richard as lead and Claire as co-lead. I wasn't on it. Walking out, I passed the operations floor where conversations had dropped to murmurs. No one looked panicked yet. They were still trying to work the way they always had, only now every decision waited on someone who needed consensus before confidence. Authority had been moved without the weight to carry it, and the result wasn't chaos, just drag. Drag turns minutes into hours, hours into misses, and misses into losses that can't be blamed on effort. The escalation wasn't loud, it was cumulative, and it was already too late to reverse without admitting what had been done. My last day ended without ceremony. I turned in my badge, signed the exit form, and walked out while people were still in meetings meant to fix problems that no longer had an owner. The next morning, my phone stayed quiet, which told me more than any message could have. It meant the systems were running, just not well. By noon, a former colleague texted asking where a certain approval lived now. I didn't respond. By the end of the week, a vendor I'd worked with for years emailed my personal address, asking if I was still available to consult because they couldn't get a straight answer from anyone inside. I replied with a single line, "I'm no longer there." Within days, the pattern hardened. Decisions stacked up waiting for signatures that kept moving. Claire was in back-to-back calls, trying to reassure people she didn't yet understand. Richard sent out updates promising alignment and momentum. The language shifted from certainty to effort, then to review, then to reassessment. A shipment missed its window because a cost exception sat with finance overnight. A client invoked a penalty clause after a delivery arrived late for the third time in 2 weeks. The response time doubled. The explanations got longer. None of it fixed the root problem, which was that authority had been placed where judgment hadn't caught up. 2 weeks later, a partner paused new orders pending clarity. That email circulated internally with a dozen people copied and no clear owner. Another client asked to move future volume to a different region temporarily. Richard framed it as seasonal adjustment. Internally, meetings multiplied. Externally, trust thinned. By the end of the month, the dashboards told a story no one could spin. Cycle times were up. Exception rates climbed. Revenue projections slipped quietly under revised assumptions. Claire asked for more headcount. Finance asked for justification. Legal asked for risk mitigation. Operations asked for guidance that used to be implicit. I heard about it secondhand, through people who were still there, careful not to ask me for anything that might put them on a line they didn't want to cross. The second month brought the investigation, though they didn't call it that. A consulting firm arrived to assess process efficiency. They interviewed staff, mapped workflows, highlighted decision bottlenecks. The report used neutral language, but the conclusions were blunt. Too many approvals, unclear accountability, loss of institutional knowledge, recommendations followed, all expensive, all slow. Clients didn't wait. One formally reduced scope, another declined to renew. A third requested senior oversight on every order, adding friction no one had the bandwidth to manage. Richard sent a note acknowledging challenges and reaffirming leadership confidence. The board requested updates weekly. By the third month, the updates turned defensive. By the fourth, quiet changes happened. Richard stopped leading meetings and started attending them. Claire's name moved down the org chart in internal decks, not announced, just adjusted. A senior interim was brought in to stabilize operations, someone with enough experience to see what had been lost, but no time to rebuild it. The losses were no longer theoretical. A region that had run tight now missed forecasts by wide margins. Penalties accumulated. Vendors tightened terms. The culture shifted from execution to explanation. I stayed out of it. I didn't comment. I didn't celebrate. I watched from a distance as the consequences unfolded in exactly the order they always do when decisions outrun understanding. By the 6th month, the restructuring memo went out. It used words like refocus and realign. Richard's role was eliminated. Claire transitioned to a different function with a narrower scope. No announcements, no blame, just changes. A few weeks later, a former client reached out to me directly to say they'd moved their business and wished things had been different. I replied politely and wished them well. The collapse didn't look like failure from the outside. It looked like erosion, small losses adding up, credibility thinning, time slipping away. It happened without speeches or villains, just the steady math of decisions made without the weight to carry them. A year later, the noise had settled. Not because everything was fixed, but because the people left inside had adjusted to a smaller version of what used to exist. I knew this not from gossip, but from the tone of the calls I received once my name stopped being sensitive to mention. Former clients reached out first, careful at the start, then direct. They didn't ask what happened. They already knew. They asked where I was and whether I was available. I was. I'd taken a role that fit the way I actually worked. Fewer layers, clear authority, expectations tied to outcomes instead of optics. No speeches, no promises, just accountability. The work moved. That mattered. From time to time, I crossed paths with people from my old company at industry events. The conversations were polite and brief. A nod, a comment about the market. No one defended the decisions anymore. They talked about lessons, about timing, about how things change. I listened and let them have it. Claire emailed me once, months later. Short note. She said she was back in a learning role somewhere. Else, smaller scope, more structure. She said she finally understood why the position had been overwhelming and thanked me for not setting her up to fail when it would have been easy to do that. I replied with one sentence wishing her well. That was enough. As for Richard, his name surfaced occasionally, usually attached to phrases like consulting or advising. Nothing permanent. Nothing that required ownership. I didn't feel anything about it. What mattered to me had already been resolved. The line that was crossed in that conference room stayed crossed, and the consequences that followed didn't require my participation to be complete. The most telling moment came on an ordinary afternoon when a former colleague called, frustrated, not angry, just tired. "I wish they'd listen to you," she said. I told her they did listen, they just chose something else. There's a difference people don't like to admit. The story people want is one where someone storms out and everything explodes immediately. That isn't how it usually works. Most of the time, it's quieter. Someone leaves. The work still gets done for a while. Then decisions slow. Then trust thins. Then the math catches up. By the time the lesson is clear, the person who could have prevented it is already gone. That's not revenge. That's gravity. I didn't win because I outplayed anyone. I won because I stopped compensating for decisions I didn't make. I didn't argue, didn't threaten, didn't sabotage. I let roles mean what they were labeled. I let authority carry its own weight. Everything after that was inevitable. If there's a reason I'm telling this now, it isn't to settle scores. It's because I know how common this is, especially for people who've been steady for a long time and mistaken that steadiness for consent. When you're reliable, people assume you'll absorb whatever they put on you. When you stop, they call it disruption. It isn't. It's alignment. Walking away didn't make me brave. It made things honest. And honesty, once introduced, doesn't need help doing its work. If this sounds familiar, you already know what I'm talking about. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you want more stories like this where outcomes speak louder than speeches, subscribe and stay with me. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I finally saw where the real strength had been hiding the whole time. It wasn't in titles, meetings, or promises. It was in the quiet work I did every day without an audience, the files I kept clean, the decisions I documented, the relationships I maintained without needing permission. When everything fell apart, none of it was dramatic. It was procedural. What surprised me most wasn't how quickly things slowed after I left. It was how little anyone understood why they'd ever worked at all. People thought momentum came from authority. It didn't. It came from preparation, from noticing patterns before they became problems, from knowing which call mattered and which one could wait. That kind of strength doesn't announce itself. It holds things together until the moment it's removed. I used to think patience meant staying quiet and waiting my turn. I was wrong. Patience is active. It's building leverage without waving it around. It's writing things down when no one asks. It's learning systems deeply enough that you don't need to explain your value out loud. When I stopped compensating, the system revealed exactly what it was. If I were giving advice to a friend, I'd say this: don't confuse silence with weakness. Don't assume visibility equals impact. And don't give away what makes you indispensable. How to get started today. Write down what only you know how to do. Track decisions, not just tasks. Build relationships that aren't tied to titles. Stop fixing problems no one sees you fix. Pay attention to who benefits from your silence. If this story sounds familiar, share it with someone who's holding things together quietly for far too long.